Hello all, and welcome to Biology 152. This is the second course in the A&P sequence at Cincinnati State, and we're going to start today with Chapter 16, which is the endocrine system. And the endocrine system has some similarities to a system that you would have studied last semester in Bio 151, and that is the nervous system. And the reason for that is both systems are there to communicate between two different parts of the body, to regulate distant parts of the body from the central nervous system primarily. But there are some differences too, and those differences primarily have to do with the mode of communication. So communication in the nervous system is primarily electrical, right? We communicate through action potentials. You have those very, very long axons, and you get these fast electrical potentials that shoot down those axons. And then you have some chemical communication in places where one neuron, the dendrite, is communicating with another neuron. But that takes a lot longer, and that's sort of where the process slows down. The vast majority of the distance is covered by electrical communication. On the other hand, endocrine system communication is entirely chemical, right? So you have organs that we call glands that will produce chemicals, and those chemicals go into the bloodstream and go all around your body. So instead of a very specific spot that we're targeting with a neuron, we're sending the signal everywhere around your body through your bloodstream, and it takes a little longer for it to get there. And the effects tend to be more widespread, and they tend to last a little bit longer. So both of these systems do use chemicals, right? Neurons will use chemical communication between two neurons. In that context, we call these things neurotransmitters. In the endocrine system, when you produce these chemicals and they go into the bloodstream and go throughout your body to communicate with usually a wide variety of target organs, we call them hormones. But very often they're the same exact chemical. So for instance, epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? Those are neurotransmitters that are often used in your nervous system to communicate between one neuron and the next in your autonomic nervous system. That said, if those same chemicals go into your bloodstream and go all over the place, we call them hormones, and they are now part of your endocrine nervous system. And so both of these are communication and regulatory mechanisms. Both generally operate by negative feedback, and both of them maintain homeostasis and regulate different parts of your body, organs, and cells and tissues. We've been talking primarily about synaptic and endocrine communication so far in terms of types of chemical communication. Synaptic being what happens across a nerve synapse or a nerve to a muscle synapse, one of those neuromuscular junctions, and endocrine communication specifically being what happens when chemicals get placed into the bloodstream and go all over the body. But there are other kinds of chemical communication within your body too. Paracrine communication is chemical communication where a single cell just puts some chemicals out just into the extracellular fluid near it and communicates just with the cells nearby. So it's not going into the bloodstream. It's not going all over the body. Direct communication is when there are chemicals that are in the plasma membranes of a cell and they hook up with chemicals in the plasma membrane of another cell, and these allow for communication. Or you have gap junctions in two cells and allows chemicals to travel directly from the cytoplasm of one cell to the cytoplasm of another. This is going to be particularly important when we talk about cardiac muscle cells, for instance. This allows them, they have these gap junctions, to coordinate their contraction very, very tightly, and so that you can have a nice coordinated pump of the heart. Now there are other kinds of chemical communication as well. These are specifically within the body. If you are communicating between two organisms, right, we call those pheromones. Right? That is also chemical communication. We are going to spend most of our time talking about endocrine communication in this chapter and hormones specifically. And one way that we can describe hormones is based on their structure. And there are a few main structural types of hormones. The first are amino acid derivatives. And remember amino acids from last semester, they're the building blocks of proteins. They're the monomers that make up the polysaccharides that we call proteins. And if you take an amino acid and you modify it just a little bit, you get an amino acid derivative. Sometimes these are called monoamines. You may have heard of monoamines. They include catecholamines like epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine. Melatonin is an example of an amino acid derivative. And then thyroid hormone is a weird example of an amino acid derivative because it's actually two amino acids crammed together. But first structural type of hormone is an amino acid derivative. While an amino acid derivative is generally a single amino acid that has been changed just a little bit, a peptide hormone is multiple amino acids put together. So it's kind of like a small protein, right? And amino acids are held together by peptide bonds. That's why when you have multiple amino acids together in a chain, we call this a peptide hormone. Things like thyroid stimulating hormone, right? TSH, luteinizing hormone, LH, follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and several others. These are all peptide hormones. The third and final structural type of hormone is a lipid-derived hormone. And these are often called steroids because they're made from cholesterol. So steroid comes from sterol. And these are going to be different from most other types of hormones in the way that they behave because they're different chemically. Now you may remember that lipids are different than a lot of proteins because whereas the majority of proteins, not all, but a lot of proteins are hydrophilic, they dissolve in water. And most amino acids are also hydrophilic, dissolve in water. Lipids are hydrophobic, meaning they do not dissolve in water. And this is because they tend to be a lot of carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon chains built together, and those carbon to carbon chains are made of nonpolar covalent bonds, so there are no little charge inconsistencies, and so they do not dissolve in water. Not dissolving in water can be an issue when, by definition, as an endocrine hormone, the way that you get around is through the blood, and the blood is mostly water. Right? Blood plasma is almost entirely water. So these steroids or lipid derivatives have to be bound to a particular target protein in the blood that can both has a hydrophobic end that binds to the lipid and a hydrophilic end that helps it dissolve in water so that it can circulate through the body. So to review, the structural types of hormones are amino acid derivatives, things like epinephrine, these catecholamines, or melatonin, peptide hormones, which are made of multiple amino acids together with peptide bonds, and lipid derivatives, or steroid hormones primarily. Examples of steroids are estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, things like that. So to end this video, I want to do a quick overview of the endocrine system and what it does and what's a part of it. And you are probably familiar with some parts of the endocrine system, right? You've heard of hormones before, and you may know that glands produce hormones, specifically endocrine glands. Exocrine glands produce things that go through a duct onto an epithelial surface. So things like sweat, or tears, or oil, or even digestive enzymes. Because technically you are a donut, and that donut hole you have goes from the mouth to the anus and is lined with epithelial tissue, which is technically on the outside, right? You swallow a penny, goes out the other end, it has never truly entered your body. So those digestive enzymes that get dumped into your digestive system are exocrine. Endocrine glands secrete things that go into the bloodstream and all around your body. So you've probably heard of your pituitary gland or your thyroid gland. You talked about the hypothalamus last semester in terms of its role as a brain structure, but it is also an important endocrine organ. These are all organs that primarily produce hormones. But you have a lot of other organs that do other things for their day job, but also produce hormones. So for instance, your heart, right? Our heart's primary job is not to produce hormones. It is to pump blood. Our kidneys, our intestines, right? These have other primary jobs. But all three of those and others also produce hormones to help regulate things that touch on the function of their day job. In your brain, two of these structures are your hypothalamus and your pituitary gland. And these two are very important because they essentially run your endocrine system. The pituitary gland primarily secretes glands that target other glands and tell them what to do, right? It's kind of in charge. The pituitary gland is two glands. It's an anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary. But the anterior pituitary tells all of the other glands what to do. It secretes hormones that target glands, then tells those glands, hey, now it's time for you to secrete your hormone that will target another part of the body. The hypothalamus is in charge of the anterior pituitary gland. And so in that way, it really runs the entire system. So pituitary gland runs your endocrine system. Hypothalamus gland runs the pituitary gland. In my nerdy brain, when I look at these two glands, I think of Star Wars. And everyone knows Darth Vader. Darth Vader was in charge of the armies of the Empire, and he told everybody what to do. Well, your pituitary gland is essentially the Darth Vader of your endocrine system, right? It is barking orders to other glands and telling them when to secrete what they secrete. But Darth Vader wasn't actually in charge of the Empire, right? There was, Emperor Palpatine, who was shadowy and behind the scenes and was whispering orders into the ear of Darth Vader, who would then give the orders to everyone else. Hypothalamus is your Emperor Palpatine. Pituitary gland is your Darth Vader. Your thyroid gland, which is, right about there, is important for two reasons. It actually produces a couple of hormones. One of them, thyroid hormone, or thyroxine, affects metabolic rate, regulates metabolism. And the other one is going to regulate calcium ion levels. Your adrenal gland is really, again, two glands, kind of like your pituitary. Your pituitary is an anterior and posterior pituitary. Your adrenal gland is an adrenal medulla in the middle and an adrenal cortex around the outside. And the adrenal cortex secretes a lot of hormones that are involved in things like mineral balance and stress, long-term stress. And those are steroid hormones from the adrenal cortex. The adrenal medulla makes adrenaline, right? What we think of the adrenal glands generally is the production of adrenaline, and that's epinephrine and norepinephrine. Works with the sympathetic nervous system and is produced by the adrenal medulla. Your pancreas is actually both an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. It's exocrine because it produces digestive enzymes. Most of the tissue in the pancreas produces digestive enzymes. We'll talk about that later when we get to the digestive system. But the pancreatic islets, meaning like tiny islets within the pancreas, those are endocrine structures, and they produce hormones that regulate glucose. Insulin, for example, and also glucagon, which counter-regulate glucose. We'll talk about that in more detail later. Your pineal gland secretes melatonin. You probably talked about this last semester with the brain. This is important for your circadian rhythm, knowing when day and night are happening. And that also affects your sleep, knowing when day and night are happening. So sometimes people take melatonin in order to sleep. It doesn't always help you sleep if you're up because of stress or things like that, but it does help tell your body that it's nighttime. On the back of your thyroid, you have parathyroid glands, which produce parathyroid hormone, which helps regulate calcium levels in your blood. And all those other organs that have other day jobs but also produce hormones, the hormones tend to be related to what they do. So your heart produces hormones that are related to blood volume. Your thymus produces hormones that are involved in immune response. Digestive tract, appetite, digestive coordination. Kidneys, blood pressure, blood cell production, things like that. Gonads, growth, metabolism, things like that. And you should become pretty familiar with this sort of image, right? I want you to be able to pick out all of these endocrine glands and structures anatomically on your body. Thanks for listening. In the next video, we'll talk a little bit more about how hormones work, the mode of action when they target a cell, and then we're going to get into a little bit more detail about the function of specific hormones and all those glands that we talked about briefly right now.